Hello everyone, this is a recording that I made of a presentation that I gave to the Bristol Underwater Photography Group, a well-known British underwater photography group called BUPG, in July 2023, relating some of my experiences of switching from a Nikon SLR camera to a Sony mirrorless camera during that first half of 2023, and I thought it would be a good presentation to share. I hope you find it useful. Hello everyone, it's really nice to be with you tonight. The aim of this talk really is to share some of my experiences of making a choice in my cameras that I probably never thought I would make, and that is to switch from a Nikon SLR to a Sony mirrorless camera. I'm not here to try to persuade you guys to switch. For many of you, your current cameras are probably the perfect cameras. For many others, you may decide to switch to a Nikon SLR or a Sony or a Canon a Nikon mirrorless or a Canon mirrorless or even a Sony mirrorless. But I thought you'd find it valuable to sort of see what I knew and thought about when I was deciding to make the switch and what I've learned since then, and some of the problems I've had and some of the solutions that I've found. So I hope that it's a useful presentation. If you'd said to me back, the photo on the left there is taken in September last year, me happily shooting my Nikon SLR up in Canada. But if you'd said to me, perhaps even at the beginning of this year, the 1st of January, that I would soon be shooting a Sony, I think I would have looked at you pretty quizzically. And certainly if 3 or 4 years ago you'd said to me, I would be, ditching Nikon gear and not even switching to Canon, but switching to Sony cameras, I think I'd have looked at you like you were crazy. But that really is, I guess, the mistake, the opportunity that both Nikon and Canon have provided with Sony, who obviously, for a long time have been making the sensors in my Nikon cameras and know a thing or two about electronics and making cameras. But that's the opportunity that they've done by really letting Sony steal a march on the transition to mirrorless, and as a result, Sony have stolen a huge market share, or taken over a huge market share, both in topside and underwater photography, with their fantastic cameras that they're making. And anyway, for me, this whole epiphany started in January when I travelled to Cayman, and the picture on the right is from Cayman, when my friend, or loosely use the term friend given the cost that he has caused me, my friend Ryan Cannon offered for me to try the new then Sony A7 R5, and I think I was the first person to try one underwater on that trip, just really for my education. It wasn't for a review. He was just like, I think this camera is great, I think you'll like it. And I was like, well, I'll give it a go on that trip. And this whole thing has sort of precipitated from that moment. I think that what surprised me about that Sony is I kind of agreed with Ryan that I would take it for a few dives on that trip. And once I tried it for a few dives, my intention was to park it up and carry on shooting with my tried and trusted and much preferred Nikon D850. And what transpired in Cayman was that I had the Nikon D850 and the Sony A7R5 sitting there side by side on the dive boat. And I kept choosing to use the Sony. Not because it was better really, but because I preferred shooting it. I was enjoying shooting it more. I was getting shots with it that I probably wasn't going to get with the Nikon. And that gave me a lot to think about and made me really realize that, I could do great wide angle with it, but it was particularly the macro fish photography, behavior photography area that the camera really excelled with, simply because its autofocus was so tremendous, both in the speed at which it would grab subjects, but more so than the speed, it was the intelligence with which you could point it at a scene and it would figure out what to focus on. Now, I'm sure as all of you know, mirrorless cameras have subject detection, autofocus, and that sort of thing. But it's more the fact that because they're using their sensors to run their autofocus, they just have this uncanny ability, certainly the latest generations, they have this uncanny ability to be able to figure out what the subject is and lock onto it. And because they're using color and actual image data for the focus, once they've grabbed onto a subject, they won't let it go. And that's hugely valuable for a photographer, because in a situation like this, for example, you'll see two fish doing something interesting, you'll get them in the frame, and then you'll try and maneuver yourself to a better composition. All the time, the camera's keeping those in focus. So you're just giving yourself, 2 or 3 steps on from someone who's got an SLR which is hunting to the background, and then they're moving themselves and it has to refocus. And that stickiness of the autofocus is incredible for that type of photography. And that really excited me. It was very excited that here was a camera I could create very different types of pictures. As is well reported, the downside of mirrorless cameras is that you give up the optical viewfinder for an electronic viewfinder. So rather than looking through your viewfinder at what the lens is seeing directly through it with an optical viewfinder, you're looking at what the sensor is capturing, showed to you on a screen through the picture. Now, if you shoot on land, in available light on land, the difference between an optical viewfinder and an electronic viewfinder is absolutely negligible. It's really easy to use. The problem is, as an underwater photographer, the electronic viewfinder doesn't do as good a job at showing us the underwater world as an optical viewfinder. And there's 2 factors to this. One is the fact that we're diving in a monochromatic world, and as you know, if you take an underwater photo with a digital camera, you will, without flash, you will get a much bluer picture than your eyes are seeing at the time. And it's that same blue picture that your electronic viewfinder is showing you. But that's not too much of a problem, because the cameras do show you quite a lot of the colour. The problem is much more the dynamic range that the electronic viewfinder can show us of a typical wide-angle scene, the typical bread-and-butter wide-angle shot that we take as underwater photographers. And this is a classic example of that, where we have a kind of a silhouette. If you imagine this picture before the flashes fire, it's a silhouetted reef with a bright water background behind, and compositionally what we need to see as photographers is the detail in that foreground at the same time as the detail in that background. You need to know where the grouper is swimming in front of the corals, and you need to know where the diver is moving in the background, so you can time your shot so that they're not behind the sea fan or that sort of thing. And this is, for me, always been the frustration of all the mirrorless cameras I'd used up to the Sony, that I just wasn't able to see enough of both of those to really feel I wasn't giving a lot away photographically. And in simple terms, the Sony showed me enough to be happy shooting it. And once you're happy with the EVF, you can then make use of all the advantages that it has for lots of other types of photography. So I would say that, that whole should I switch to mirrorless thing comes down to, as an underwater photographer, to how much will the autofocus enhancements benefit you, and how much will the viewfinder hinder you, the electronic viewfinder. And what I would say about the Sony, and one of the main reasons I chose Sony, was that I think it has the best autofocus, so the positives were the best, and the EVF is also the best out there, and so the negatives were minimized, and that for me meant that this camera was hugely attractive, and it was why I went in that direction. They are also, very easy to use cameras, and we're making use of sort of the advancements over the last 5 years since the last SLRs were made, in terms of camera technology, which definitely does allow us to nail some incredible shots. However, I didn't choose to change straight away after that Cayman trip, partly because it felt like a monumental decision and I wanted a little bit more thinking time. But I would also say that it was because I had a very important Lembeh trip coming up in March, and I was concerned that the Sony wouldn't do as good a job in Lembeh, not photographically, but in terms of the total system capabilities. And I think that was probably a slight fear of the unknown, and I would now straight away take the Sony to Lembeh. But the reasons for that was that with my Nikon, I use 3 different macro lenses typically, and that's important for me when I go to a place like Lembeh, because I'm not going there just to get one great contest shot. I want to come home with quite a visually diverse portfolio for publishing pictures, for writing magazine articles, and that sort of thing. And if I just shoot the whole of Lembeh with one macro lens, all my shots have a very similar perspective. And that's not so good when you suddenly have, 10 or 15 of them in a magazine spread, and they're all very samey. And so for me, it's always been important to shoot with lots of different lenses on any trip to diversify my portfolio. And with a Nikon, I could shoot with a Nikon 60, Nikon 105, and the Sigma 150. Whereas the only high quality macro lens that was really available to me for the Sony was the 90mm, which is a really great lens, but I felt I'd be giving too much away not having those other options. The other factor, which was a purely or kind of very personal one as well, was that back in 2020, I got the Nauticam EMWL bug eye lens, and I have been loving that lens. It's one of my favorite things to shoot underwater. What it really excels at is wide angle macro of muck diving critters. And I have been waiting since 2020 to go to a muck diving destination like Lembeh or the Philippines. And this was finally my chance to use the EMWL in the environment in which it would really flourish. And I had heard that the EMWL doesn't work so well with all the mirrorless cameras. And I wasn't, although I tried it on the Sony and it did work fine, I wasn't willing to risk my final, after 2-3 years waiting, my chance to try the MWL in Lembeh on trying a new camera at the same time. So I think that's one of the reasons why I switched. But what I found, that was when I got to Lembeh, there were a number of people on my workshops there shooting with Sony cameras, and I was constantly bugging them to borrow their cameras. And the good thing about running a workshop is everyone trusts you to borrow their camera. So I was able to borrow both an A7R5 and a Sony A1 during that trip for the odd dive when the owners were deciding to have a massage or sit out a night dive or something. So I mainly got to shoot the Sonys at night, but I did get the chance to shoot them quite a bit in Lembeh when their owners weren't using them. And this is me with the A7R5 there in Lembeh. But mostly I was shooting them at night. But that was kind of great because in many ways, Blackwater is one of the areas where people have sort of, said, well, the ultimate Blackwater camera is the Nikon D850 with a 60mm lens. And what was great in Lembeh was going down with the Sony with a 90mm and finding I preferred it to the Nikon with the 60mm with the subjects there on the Blackwater dives. And so that was really, another nice piece of reassurance. The other thing that I managed to do in Lembeh was that I had been doing some research in between the two trips. And typically it's been very easy to adapt Canon SLR lenses to Sony mirrorless cameras, but no one was really putting Nikon lenses on them. And there aren't many adapters to do so. But what I had found is that I couldn't find one in Europe, but I could find one at B&H in New York, an adapter that allowed you to use a Nikon SLR lens on a Sony mirrorless camera. And that was really exciting for me because obviously I own a lot of Nikon lenses. Sorry, my phone was ringing. I was able to buy one of those adapters from B&H, and one of the group brought it out for me, and I was able to try underwater the Nikon 60mm on the Sony, which is what I took this long-arm octopus with, and I also was able to try on land the 8-15, the 105 and the 16-35 lens, all of which worked on the Sony mirrorless very happily. So that was really encouraging that I could use those lenses. And in fact, that for me was one of the main reasons I didn't really consider that from any further buying a Nikon Z camera, because there was no lens that I would be able to use with an adapter on a Nikon Z camera that I couldn't use on the Sony. And that kind of, immediately then meant I could have all the advantages of the Sony without any of the disadvantages relative to the Nikon Z cameras, which was really exciting. So for my next trip to Iceland, I'd got myself a Sony camera. I decided in the end to choose a Sony A1 camera over the A7R5. But my intention is probably to add an A7R5 as the second camera later this year. I generally like to operate with a pair of housings. They don't go on every trip for luggage allowance reasons, but certainly I like that ability to have two housings set up differently when opportunity allows. One of the nice things about the Sonys actually is they all kind of are the same shape, so you can quite regularly fit the same camera, different cameras into the same housings. But you can certainly fit an A7R5 into a Sony A1 housing. And there's me with the Nauticam A1 housing in Iceland, and Byron took this picture of me up there. This is my first dive with the camera, actually. It was the only dive he brought his camera in with his strobes on, so I could get a nice photo of me shooting the camera. This is in the lagoon at Silfra. I think what really Silfra obviously wasn't, it's a very extreme type of underwater photography, but it was a very good test of the A1, and I think what really impressed me with the A1 was its high ISO performance. I would say at low ISO, the 50 megapixel Sony chip in the A1 isn't any better than the 47 megapixel Sony chip in the Nikon D850. Perhaps it's not quite as good even at low ISO, but at high ISO it's way better. It's very, very noise free. It's a really, really nice sensor. So it was good to test it in that extreme environment. This is Byron diving in Silfra, and there's another shot with Byron, this one with strobe in Silfra. So I had a good chance to work the camera in Iceland, but it was a little bit extreme. It was quite good to have tried the camera at high ISO, in low light, in low temperatures and all those sorts of things. But I was really waiting for my next trip to Tubataha in Philippines to give the camera a much more typical workout, doing lots of dives a day, shooting it on the reefs and in rather different temperatures. It was very warm there, so I was just diving in rash vest and shorts, and lugging the Sony around underwater, which was great. I think what that trip taught me was that the camera could do reef wide angle, very, very pleasingly, very capably. And it really made use of one of the features that attracted me to the Sony A1, which is that a lot of the mirrorless cameras have a slower flash synchronization speed than the SLRs. And that's a bit of a negative point against them, because obviously we use flash in every picture underwater. And what I liked about the Sony A1 was that both from wide angle and for macro, it has a native flash sync speed of 1/400th of a second. So it's a couple of clicks less ambient light in your pictures. And that's an attractive feature, particularly on bright, as it was in the Philippines, bright coral reefs. I use that a great deal on that trip. So on now sort of to some of the features of the camera. And the first thing I would say is to talk about autofocus. And the mirrorless cameras have incredible autofocus capabilities and also a huge amount of adjustability and complicated modes and things. And they can feel a little bit intimidating to begin with. But the first thing I would say is that they all have the same modes and the same capabilities as the SLRs had, plus a whole lot more. So you can always turn off anything you don't understand early on and build up to it. And that was something that I sort of started with. So, for example, this picture here is taken with single point autofocus and back button autofocus. And so, very simple, just focused underwater on the ray, locked the focus off and then shot my splits. But I think what's exciting about it is actually as you start to use more of the modes. And the first thing you'll notice with autofocus relative to an SLR is that the mirrorless cameras can focus right across the frame, right up into the corners of the frame, which is great for compositionally. As you move that autofocus point around, you really can exploit off-center autofocus positions. But their ability to focus on moving subjects is really what marks them out. So I typically use quite a lot of wider sensor areas turned on and just allowing the camera to pick its focus point. And this is one of the most challenging autofocus type of shots that I do regularly. And this is an open aperture shot of an anthias swimming in front of the sun at sunset. And this is actually a very difficult shot to do with an SLR because you're having to stare right into the sun. And I have to say, this is a shot where the electronic viewfinder definitely outperforms the optical viewfinder, because I find doing this with an optical viewfinder, the sun is very dazzling. Whereas with an electronic viewfinder, it controls the sun much better and you can see exactly what you're doing. So it's a much easier shot. But it was much easier to do as well because the autofocus, I just really trusted it to pick up the eye of the anthias. And I'd say doing these shots, I mean, it's a low return shot, it's a difficult shot. Doing these shots on an SLR, I'd expect to get 1 out of 20, 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20 critically sharp on the eye. I would say with the Sony, I was getting 1 out of 3, maybe, in really critically in focus on the eye, which just meant that I'd go and spend a whole dive doing these. And I literally went down, and after about 5-10 minutes, I thought, well, I've got enough of those. I'll go and do something else. So yeah, a real advantage autofocus wise in that challenging situation. I think what you notice most though about the autofocus is because it's using sensor data, it's very good at figuring out what the subject is. It doesn't tend to run and jump and focus on the background. It's very good at picking out the subject and then keeping it in focus. And the picture on the right, it's a shot with a blenny in a tube and a diver looking at it. And I think that a lot of maybe intelligent autofocus systems from SLRs would have locked onto the diver in the background. And what was great with the Sony is it really locked onto that foreground subject. However, had I had subject recognition turned on, and all the mirrorless cameras have some degree of subject recognition, and you can tell them to look for animals or birds or vehicles or people. If I'd had people recognition on, the camera would definitely have focused on the diver and left the blenny out of focus. So you need to think very carefully about whether you're going to introduce those modes. I would very rarely ever use people underwater unless I was on a specific shoot to photograph a model or something, and the model was going to be the focal point of all the shots. Then I might use people focus. I use animal autofocus quite a lot on macro. It's very good at picking up eyes of things. But though it does sometimes get confused. I was photographing a moray eel with animal focus on, and it was convinced that the big nostril of the moray eel was its eye, and it kept focusing on the nostril rather than the eyes behind, which was frustrating. But generally that autofocus works really well on subject recognition. Many of you have photographed these very tiny little blennies. This is a blue belly blenny. I won't say that again. In the Red Sea, and they're very, very small, and I shot this with an SMC1, and even through the SMC1 the animal detection worked perfectly well on this, and I was framing this up, and within a half a second or so there was a big green square over the eye of the blenny, and I knew that the eye was then going to be in perfect focus, and I could move the camera around, change my composition slightly, and the camera just kept the focus on the face of the blenny and made taking this shot very easy. I know with an SLR I would always shoot these with fixed focus and very careful rocking in and out, and with the SMC1, and now I just stick it on autofocus and it just picks it up and I shoot away. I really love the camera for fish photography, and particularly moving fish. I think it has a very high return rate of grabbing the faces, grabbing the eyes, and getting them sharp. This is a Klunzinger wrasse in the Red Sea, a long exposure to generate that movement, and very easy to frame and focus this, just tracking the fish around and letting the camera do the hard work. When you have those split-second opportunities, I think that's another area that the autofocus system really shines. This is a pair of goatfish duking it out over territory, and I think that this picture here shows them very nicely. Shows very nicely how the autofocus can pick them up and grab them. Another behaviour shot, and this is kind of a bit of a personal mission for me. For years and years and years, I've watched damselfish race out of their territories and chase off big fish. And I've always wanted pictures of it, but I've always found that I've never been able to get them into focus in time. You're often a little bit further away. It's often big parrotfish that autofocus systems don't like focusing on. And what really surprised me in the Red Sea is I actually got 2 of these shots on that trip. Just, randomly it happened in front of me. I was able just to pull the camera up and hit shoot and capture these split-second moments where the damselfish rushes out and the other fish races away. And I was able to grab 2 of these shots, actually, this one and one of a parrotfish as well. The other area that the electronic viewfinder, another area that the electronic viewfinders work very well is in very dark places. So this is in the bottom of the Janus D wreck. This is off the engine room of the Janus D. There's a small workshop area, and this is the lathe in the workshop. I put this in for Arthur, just to, I know he'd like to see a lathe in the talk. This case here, it's a very dark room, but the electronic viewfinders can brighten and darken for the conditions with auto gain, and they can show you what you're seeing. And it was great to be able to see this very clearly, even though it was dark. I mean, the picture goes a bit, pixely in low light, but I'm not worried about the details. I know the camera's in focus. I'm worried about the framing, and I could see everything really, really well for that, to be able to make this picture in what is a very dark corner of the wreck. The other thing with the electronic viewfinder that I like is for reviewing images, and particularly for guessing exposure. In very bright conditions on an LCD screen, it can be very difficult to judge exposure. And the same in very dark conditions when you're shooting, say, in caves or inside shipwrecks. The pictures can look very bright on the LCD because you're in a dark environment, and it can cause you to underexpose. So you kind of end up overexposing in bright conditions so that you can see the pictures, and underexposing in dark conditions because they look so bright. One of the things about the judging your pictures on your EVF is that you can see them really clearly, and obviously because the EVF is eye corrected, if your eyesight is aging a little, you also get to see them in really sharply through the EVF. So I really like those features of the EVF. The other factor is you're not pushing the camera away from you to see. One of the things you commonly see with underwater photographers is they'll shoot a picture with their SLR, and then to review it, they'll thrust their camera away from them so that they can look at the LCD screen and and see it in focus. And in doing so, they stir up sediment. They sometimes scare off the subject, sometimes even bump into the subject when they do that without realizing. And one of the things I really like about the EVF is if I want to review, the pictures just come up in the screen as I'm looking at the screen. I don't have to move my head. I don't have to move my body. The animal stays relaxed. I don't stir up sediment. It's a very efficient way of shooting. Also, if I want to change settings, and particularly camera custom settings and things during the shoot, again, that all the menus of the camera, all the settings of the camera, I can view them through that electronic viewfinder. So again, I don't need to move my head from the camera. I'm simply just keep the camera to my eye, and if I want to activate rear curtain flash sync or something like that, I can just dig through the modes and have that activated very easily without me having to hold the camera away, look at the LCD screen. And in fact, one of the things I've said is I would quite happily, if I ever see like a mirrorless camera for sale with the main LCD screen damaged or broken, I would happily buy that camera, because in underwater photography, I almost never use the LCD screen. Only very occasionally if I'm sort of shooting from the hip or something like that and I want to use it. But I am, 99% of my interaction with my camera is through the Nauticam optical viewfinder, looking at the very large high resolution electronic viewfinder. And it's an important point to make that the electronic viewfinders of the mirrorless cameras are much higher resolution than the LCD screens on the back, even though they're smaller. They're much higher quality, and they're designed to be your main interface with the camera. Just the other factor that I think worries people about mirrorless camera is battery life. And I would say, first of all, that there's no mirrorless camera out there that can't comfortably do one dive very happily. I would say that most of them can do 2 dives with lots to spare. And I know from my own experience that I shoot far more photos than most people. I would definitely say I'm in the top 5% of number of photos taken on a dive compared to the average person. And I've always been able to get through 2 dives if I have new batteries at the beginning of the first dive. And I usually find with my Sony, which it does have some of the better battery life of the mirrorless cameras, it's renowned for that, I can always do 2 dives, and I nearly always have, after 2 dives, somewhere between 60 and 40% battery remaining. So I could almost certainly do a 3rd dive, but 2 dives is always I always change after 2 dives. I don't want to run out. I've once run the battery out in 2 dives, and that was when I was up in Iceland, and I'd been out doing some land photography first, and I had intended to do 1 dive and change, and I forgot. And at the end of the 2nd dive in Sulphur in 2-degree water, so it was very cold as well, in the last minute of the dive, the battery ran out. So that's given me the confidence to know that I can always, as long as I've got fresh batteries, I'll always get through 2 dives. So I only travel with 2 batteries for my mirrorless camera. I have the one that's in it and 1 spare, and I just change them after every 2 dives. And in reality, most places you're not going to be on any dive boat which after 2 dives you can't open your housing. Even if no one really, you don't go out and do 3 dives on a boat that doesn't have some sort of cover, some sort of toilet, that sort of thing. And so for me, as long as you can get through 2 dives, you're really not going to be in a situation where you can't safely open your housing for a second and change your battery. And I've never been, those of you who dive with me know, I've never been concerned about opening my housing up. I grew up in an era shooting film, and we used to open our housings after every dive all the time. And sometimes even we'd come up mid-dive to change roll of film and open the housing up. So it's never bothered me to open a housing in any situation. I'm not someone who needs to be in laboratory clean conditions to start fiddling with my camera. But I know people are worried about that, so it's worth mentioning. Battery life does vary a little bit, obviously with temperature, but depending on what you're shooting. I've been shooting, as I'll talk about in a few slides' time, quite a few mechanical lenses with the Sony camera. The picture on the left here was shot with a Nikonos 15mm, the old Nikonos 5 lens on the Sony. And when I'm shooting with a mechanical lens, it does use a bit less batteries. If I'm doing autofocus or lenses with stabilizers and autofocus heavy macro photography like the picture on the right, the camera does use a little bit more battery life. So maybe if I was sort of on a shore diving trip in Bali and I was doing 2 90-minute dives, I think I'd be, you know, pushing the batteries much closer to the limit than if I was doing sort of 2 60-minute wide angle dives. But generally, I'm very confident that my camera would happily get through 2 dives, whether they were 2 long macro dives or 2 short wide angle dives. The wide angle, obviously, I'm typically using less power. One thing I'm not completely happy with the Sony, and all the pictures in this talk have been with the Sony, is I'm not always completely happy with the color of the shots. I think Sony's white balance, the auto white balance, doesn't do a very good job underwater, and I predominantly am shooting with a Kelvin white balance on the camera, and that makes me a bit happier with my pictures straight out of the camera. But I also find the adjustability of the A1 files on color not as nice as with my Nikon D850 with the Sony sensor in that. I'm curious. I'm going to try the Nikon Z8 on my next trip, and I'm curious to see how the Z8 does on color. Whether it's kind of the Nikon sort of firmware software inside the camera is getting a slightly better file out than the Sony, or whether it's just something to do with the stack sensors, which both the A1 and the Z8, Z9 all have those stack sensors, which I think does impact a little bit on the quality, mine in a small way, perhaps, of these colors. Anyway, overall though, I'm very, you know, I'm not disappointed with the color of these shots. But there is a slightly different look to my Sony pictures, which I just mentioned for completeness. Shutter speed is quite a big issue as well in the world of mirrorless, and particularly the high synchronization speed. Now, a lot of the underwater pictures we take don't need high flash sync. This picture here is taken on 1/4 of a second to burn that blue background in behind the trucks here in the Thistlegorm. And yeah, it's fine. One thing it's worth mentioning is that all the mirrorless cameras do have an inbuilt stabilizer, which does make it a lot easier to handhold and get sharp the ambient light in these longer exposure shots. But in terms, I really want to talk about the fast sync speed, and quite a lot of the cameras are a bit limited, and the Nikon cameras in particular. One thing that's a big sort of black mark for me is they are limited to 1/200th on flash sync. And there were plenty of times as an underwater photographer, I want to be able to quell the ambient light by using faster flash syncs than that, particularly in the tropics. And what I like particularly about the Sony A1 is I can use flash syncs up to 1/400th of a second. And that's something I've been using a lot, certainly in the reef wide angle situation and also for the macro situation. Being able to control that ambient light is an attractive feature. This wide angle picture here is shot at 1/400th of a second, allowing me to really darken down that reef behind, control the sun, control the watercolor, and get this nice dramatic black background, which is what I wanted behind this school of Antheus and the corals in front of them. The data on the right is actually just all my pictures that I haven't deleted yet from the Red Sea. And I've got about 1,800 left. I shot about 9,000, and I've edited that down now to about 1,800. And it's just the shutter speeds and how many shots I took at each shutter speed. There are actually quite a few slower than this. I just showed you one that was shot at 1/4 of a second, but I could only get so many on the screen. But it shows that actually 37%, so if I add up the numbers in the 250th, 320th and 400, 37% of the shots that I chose to shoot in the Red Sea were taken at faster flash synchronization speeds than I would have been able to do with a Nikon Z camera. And I think that shows that, you know, it also means that 3% weren't. So it doesn't mean that it's a make or break just for underwater photography, but I have to say, once you get used to having that ability to shoot flash sync at higher sync speeds, you do use it a considerable amount of the time. So I'm going to finish off just by talking about the lens choice. And one of the things that I said at the beginning is one of the reasons I didn't switch to a mirrorless camera for my trip to Lembeh was I was worried by the lens choice of Sony. And I think over the months since then, I've discovered that there's actually quite a wide range of lenses I can use with the Sony. And some are native and some are adapted. But I'm pretty happy now that I'm getting a very diverse portfolio of perspectives from the camera. One of the workhorse lenses for macro is the Sony 90mm. Sony make a cheap 50mm, which I'm not especially interested in. Sigma make a 105, but again, it's so close to the 90, it's not really worth having. You know, you're better off having, I mean, you know, I'm very happy to have the Sony 90. It's not like 105 is some magic number. 90 is kind of similar to the 105. It's slightly different. I quite like that. It means that I shoot things with slightly more space around them. I do like the fact that the 90mm works really well with the SMC2. I didn't used to use the SMC2 very much on the 105. I felt it was just a bit too strong with the 105. With the 90mm, it feels much more usable lens. So I've always been lending that lens to Martin Guest, the SMC2. But actually now I find that actually I'm starting to use it quite a bit more. So this is shot with the SMC2 in the Red Sea of one of the Unicorn Gobies. The 90mm is a great fish photography lens, and it's also got a particularly beautiful bokeh. It just creates a very buttery smooth out of focus part of the picture, which is great for setting off backgrounds around macro subjects. So that's something I really like about that lens. I'm very happy with the Sony 90mm. It's very sharp. On the latest Sony cameras, it focuses super fast. I know it was quite slow on some of the early Sony cameras, but I think that was more to do with the cameras than the lens. But very fast focusing and really nice quality. So I'm very happy with that lens. For my other macro lenses, I've been using adapted Nikon lenses. Frustratingly for me, I can't use on my adapter my Sigma 150 lens. It's got the wrong type of autofocus to work on the adapter, but I can use my Nikon 60 and 105. As I said before, the 105 is kind of too similar to the 90mm to really be worth using, but the 60mm is really nice, and it's nice and wide, and I tried that in Lembeh, and I've also shot it in the Red Sea. I actually have been using that 60mm more recently with a curved port. This is something I used to use on the SLR a lot. The curved port rather than a flat port makes the lens up to 30% wider, so it differentiates it more from the 90mm. It also gets rid of any chromatic aberrations that you get quite commonly in the corners of 60mm shots. Now, if it's just black in the corners, it doesn't matter. But often with the 60mm, if you've got seabed, all that seabed detail gets quite ugly in the corners of the frame, just because it's quite a wide lens to use behind a flat port. Whereas with the curved port, it gets rid of that. And Nauticam happened to have a port called the 4-inch port, which has got this curved front element, which works perfectly with the 60mm. You can just about see my 60mm sitting inside it here in this photo of the lens, and I've been really happy with how that performs underwater. I've not been really to any destinations that are really suiting the 60mm, but I can see this being a major workhorse lens next time I'm in Lembeh. For wide angle, the fisheyes are relatively easy. There are no native fisheyes yet for any of the mirrorless systems, whether that's Nikon, Canon, or Sony. But there are. It's very easy to adapt them. I've obviously, as a Nikon user, own the Nikon 8-15mm fisheye, and that lens can be adapted using the same adapter as I use for all the other Nikon lenses. And optically, I'm very happy with that lens on the Sony. Really, really nice. Lots of different subjects I've shot with that. And that's really good. I would say, though, if you're starting from scratch, the Canon fisheye lens is best. It just the adapters are a little bit more mature products than the Nikon adapter, and just it's slightly more user friendly. There's kind of one little bug in the Nikon adapter that I have to have a sort of if it goes to sleep, it loses its focus, the camera, whereas the Canon lens doesn't do that. So if you were starting from scratch, I'd buy the Canon 8-15. Optically, I don't find any difference, but the adapter is just slightly nicer. But it hasn't concerned me. I'll happily shoot the Nikon one. It's just a minor point. I've also been enjoying using some mechanical lenses. This is the Nauticam 13mm fisheye. This is a mechanical lens, so it's manual aperture, manual focus. But for wide angle shooting, that's really not too big a deal. And Nauticam may put this into production one day. It's a very similar footprint size as the Nikon 13mm. There's Mark's hands actually, and his Nikonos RS 13mm autofocus lens next to the Nauticam mechanical focus 13mm lens. And one thing I like about the Nauticam lens is actually it sticks out quite a long way, which actually really helps with lighting, particularly when you're close to the subjects with it. And yeah, I've been enjoying shooting that lens. Shot it lots of places, both in the Red Sea. This is Red Sea shot and a picture from the Philippines. Very nice lens. Very, very good in lots of types of environments. It's particularly suited for, I think, for cave photography because of the high quality optics, and sort of dark spaces. Because again, that fixed focus, you're not having to worry about autofocus. You just set the autofocus. You set the focus point once mechanically, check it's correct, and then shoot. With the EVF, you've got a magnifier on the EVF, so if you want to zoom into 100% while you're framing up, you can check your critical focus. But once I've done that once for the dive, I'm usually pretty happy it's going to be fine for the rest of the dive, and I'll just carry on shooting with it. I also think this lens will be very useful for big animal shooting when you're you want a small compact rig and you're just jumping off the boat and shooting away, and you don't need to worry about focus. In fact, you don't want the focus to be upset by bubbles or distractions in the water. You just want to get underwater and go dagger, 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 dagger on the subject. Another mechanical lens that I've been enjoying shooting, just really for fun more than anything, is the Nikonos 15mm mechanical lens from the Nikonos 5. So not like Mark's autofocus 13mm from the RS. This is a mechanical lens from the Nikonos 5. But I've enjoyed shooting this. It's often talked about as the best optical underwater lens. I honestly don't find it any better than the WWL or WACP. It's good. It really is good. I mean, it's up there, but it's not any better. They're all really good in terms of sharpness, color saturation. It's good, but it's no better. But it is really nice and small, and it is easy to add to your bag when you're traveling. And it's relatively easy to shoot. Again, using that zoom magnifier, the focus peaking. I'll talk a bit more about peaking in a second. But focus peaking doesn't work very well with these wide-angle lenses. But the magnifying viewfinder does. So you can just zoom into 100%, check the critical focus, zoom back out, and shoot away. And obviously, you're generally keeping it fixed throughout the dive. It's often referred to as the Rolls Royce. The Nikonos 15mm was often called the Rolls Royce of underwater photography lenses. But that was back in the 80s. And I think when anyone asks me, should they get one of these, I say, well, would you buy a 1980s Rolls Royce? And that kind of sums up the argument pretty well. I've enjoyed playing with the Trioplan 100 lens, which I've been able to adapt pretty easily to my Sony. It's much easier to focus. This one really does work well peaking. And peaking is basically where in your viewfinder the camera tells you when something's in focus by making it change color where the focus point is. And with the Trioplan, when you're sort of moving in towards the subject, you just wait for the eyes of the subject to light up, and you know that they'll be in focus. So I find that this is actually easier to shoot on the Sony than on the Nikon, which is great. And then I think one of the main attractions for me, though, for going to Sony was that the lenses, there's a number of lenses that are particularly suitable for using with Nauticam's underwater optics. And the 28 to 60mm, which is kind of a kit lens, but an expensive kit lens, works very well both with the WACP and the WWL. So I have the choice between those two lenses. The WACP-1 is big, heavy, ultimate quality. The WWL does exactly the same thing, but just in a smaller, cheaper package. And for me, if I'm on a trip where I'm probably not going to use that focal range as much, I'll quite often take the WWL to save some luggage weight, because it is a good 1.5 kilos lighter. But if the trip's all about that sort of mid-range, that wide-angle zoom, then I'll take the WWL. Sorry, the WACP for ultimate quality. They both give the same picture area, just one at a better quality, and I like having that choice. I can take the small one when I'm probably going to use it once on a trip, and I'll take the big heavy one if it's going to be a main lens of the trip. On my recent Red Sea trip, I actually had the WWL on for probably what was my best dive of the trip, where everything was just beautiful light, clear water, all the subjects were out. These shots are all taken on the same dive. And the reef was just incredible. The schools were incredible. And yeah, I was very happy to be shooting the WWL. It really gave me the flexibility to take in all those subjects. Nauticam also have a new lens on the horizon. The WACP stands for wide angle conversion port, and their new lens is called the FCP, which is the fisheye conversion port. It's smaller than the WACP one. So here the fisheye conversion port is the one on the left, and the WACP one is the one on the right, and lighter. Not massively smaller, but a good sort of 25% smaller, which makes it a bit more travel friendly. And this lens stretches your standard kit lens out into a fisheye. So it gives you you can have a native kit lens on the 2860 on the camera, and then the fisheye converter port turns that into a wide angle lens, turns that into a fisheye lens, allowing you to take on big scenes. But also, because you can zoom it in, you can shoot incredibly small stuff as well on the same dive. So it's an incredibly flexible system. These two shots here are both taken on the Thistlegorm with the FCP, and in fact most of the wide angle shots I've shown in this talk have been FCP shots. And the trucks here, you can shoot a big wide fisheye shot like that, and then because the lens is relatively small at the front, it's very good at close focus work and close focus lighting. And that Sergeant Major shot is not cropped, it's just zoomed into 60mm, not cropped. And even something as small as a single medium small fish, you can get pretty big in the frame. So there's a huge range of subjects that this lens can shoot. So you can generally use your wide angle. You can do your bigger scenes, your bigger wide angle scenes. You can then deal with schools of fish, even individual fish, with just a little bit of zooming in. And then if you want to zoom in a lot more, you can sort of do much more of a mid-rangey type shot with it. So it's a very, very flexible system. And because it's using a native lens as well, it's really nice. And from a travel perspective, you're traveling with this very tiny little zoom lens to be able to adapt them with. The final lens option I was going to talk about was the EMWL, which I have been very happy with how it shoots on the Sony. In fact, I prefer shooting it on the Sony than I do on my SLR. And that's really because it autofocuses so well with the Sony. And I literally have been using it as I don't even look through the camera often. I just take the lens down with just the base unit and the objective lens, leaving behind the middle relay section. And I just don't bother looking through the camera. I just point the lens at the subject, and I trust the lens to be in focus. And it's been a really, really nice way of shooting. And it allows me to just, if I'm on a macro dive, just have that small section of it in my pocket, stick it on the front of the housing, and create really interesting and different images. This is a fun final shot. This is a Sergeant Major using its tail to try and wash away the EMWL as I take a wide angle macro of it and its nest on the Thistlegorm wreck. Right, that's everything I wanted to say. Hopefully that's given you a flavour for my experience and my enthusiasm for shooting this new system. I'm not extolling everyone to change, but I felt that, I've been really enjoying it. I've found some significant advantages, and I felt that was worth sharing. So thank you for listening.